Welcome back, everyone. My name is Bianca. I'm a customer success engineer here at Prefect, and you are watching Module 104 of PAL. If you haven't watched the previous videos, I would recommend checking those out first because a lot of the material that's covered there will prepare you for the material that is covered in this module. Now, if you want to follow along with the lab at home or run any of the examples yourself, there is going to be a GitHub repository that is linked either down in the description if you're watching from YouTube, or if there is a Prefect engineer that is guiding you through the PAL program, they will be sure to get you the updated version of the GitHub repository with the completed examples there. And now we're ready to kick things off. Here's the agenda for this module. We're going to learn about creating work pool-based deployments with the .deploy method. We're also going to learn more about running flows on Prefect's infrastructure with a Prefect-managed work pool. We're also going to get a better handle on using workers with the hybrid work pool for maximum control over our infrastructure. We're going to specifically cover the process and Docker work pools in this module. We're also going to review different ways of storing your flow code between GitHub and inside of a Docker image. So, why would you want to use a work pool-based deployment? Infrastructure is a pain, and Prefect makes it better. So for those of you that are not DevOps engineers by trade, you won't have anything to worry about here. This will allow you to run workflows on a variety of dynamic infrastructure and provides a nice template for teams that want to deploy their workflows to production. Work pools also allow you to scale down your infrastructure when it's not in use and prioritize work. You can create a deployment with .deploy. In the previous modules, we reviewed the .serve method in detail and ran a few examples of creating deployments using the .serve method. There are a few differences, though, between .deploy and .serve. For starters, you have to specify a work pool when you use .deploy. You also need to specify flow code storage, so you need to point to a source for where your flow code lives. And it does not start a process that watches for scheduled runs like you would get if you ran .serve, for example. Let's get into managed work pools. What are Prefect-managed work pools? Managed work pools allow you to run workflows on Prefect's infrastructure instead of your own. So if you are interested in leveraging cloud compute but don't necessarily want to provision the resources yourself, managed work pools are a really good option for you. So you can consider this an easy mode to deployment. You don't need to host a worker or a polling process in your infrastructure to get jobs to run on a schedule. And there are a few limitations that you need to be aware of regarding managed work pools, including compute hours, concurrency limits, and the fact that you can't use custom Docker images. You have to use the Prefect 3 base image and then add your dependencies on top of that. To get started with work pool-based deployments, you can create a deployment using the .deploy method, so that's using the Python SDK, and you can specify flow code storage using the from source method. In this scenario, we're setting up a Prefect-managed work pool, so in the UI, what you're going to want to do is go to the work pools page, create a new work pool, and then choose the Prefect-managed work pool type. When you get around to doing this, I'd recommend not modifying the job template immediately. Another thing to note is that you can specify environment variables if you would like. Work pools in general make it easy for data engineering platform teams to create guardrails for other teams. Here you can see an example of creating a deployment for a managed execution work pool. We're using the from source and .deploy methods here. The from source method is specifying where exactly our code storage is and where Prefect can find the flow function. In this case, we've passed in the GitHub URL as our source, and the entry point is designating where exactly in the repository the flow function lives. So this is showing that it is in a 102 folder in the repo, and it is inside of the weather2-tasks Python file. The colon is preceding the name of the flow function, which in this case is pipeline. So pipeline is the name of the flow that we're going to deploy here. The deploy method is specifying the name of the deployment that we are creating. So my first managed deployment, and we have also passed in the work pool name, which is my managed work pool, or the name of the deployment which was created previously in the last few slides. Once you run that .deploy script, what you should see is a new deployment record in your Prefect environment, and an option to schedule a run of this deployment from the CLI if you want. All you would need to do is copy and paste that command. Here is what it would look like in the Prefect Cloud UI. So this is the deployment page. As you can see here, it's got some information pertaining to the schedules, the success rate, upcoming runs, etc. And if you run that deployment, what will happen is it will kick off a new flow run of the script that we created the deployment for. Keep in mind that at runtime, Prefect will pull your code from GitHub. It'll run your code in a Docker container on our infrastructure. It will monitor and report the state of your workflow, and then once everything is done, the container will exit and everything will be cleaned up. Building off of our previous knowledge with states, if you kick off a new deployment, you will see the natural progression of a flow run between the following states, from scheduled to pending to running to hopefully completed. It'll take a moment to spin up the Docker container on our infrastructure, so don't be too upset if it doesn't kick off immediately. Alrighty, let's break this down. Work pools. What are Prefect work pools? They are a server-side concept, and they provide default infrastructure configuration for deployments. Deployments that use this work pool inherit these settings. So if there are settings that you define inside of a work pool template when you create it, the deployments submitted to that work pool will inherit those settings by default. All right, let's talk a little bit more about flow code storage. There are a bunch of different flow code storage options to pick and choose from. The first, obviously, is local storage. Alternatively, you can use Git-based storage as well, or you can bake your code into a Docker image if that's what you would prefer. And last but not least, there's the option to use cloud provider storage if you'd prefer to have everything inside of a bucket somewhere. If you want to use GitHub storage in tandem with the .deploy method, you're going to pass in the URL to the from source method. In addition to the URL, you are also going to provide an entry point path and a flow function name. And there's the format of how you are going to do that. You'd start with a path, put a colon there, and then follow up with a flow function name. If your repo is not public, you can use private ones as well. You'll just need to pass in some extra credentials in order to pull the code at runtime. Let's learn a little bit more about the hybrid model now. So there is an option to choose hybrid work pools with workers. This diagram represents the hybrid model setup. As you can see, there is a larger box here that represents Prefect Cloud. Inside of it, we have the API server, the database, and the work pool. The API server is essentially what lets us interact with Prefect Cloud. And then you can see outside of Prefect Cloud is where that worker process is sitting. It's a lightweight polling process that you host inside of your infrastructure, and essentially you are responsible for keeping the lights on for this little guy, although it demands very few resources in order to run. hence the emphasis on the lightweight aspect of this process. And what this worker does is it will send outbound requests to the work pool, checking to see if there are any upcoming flow runs. And in the event that there is an upcoming scheduled run, or maybe a run that was triggered by an event, based on the schedule or how soon the start time of the flow run is, the worker will then provision the necessary infrastructure to run that flow run. So let's say, for example, this worker is an ECS task worker that's sitting inside of an ECS cluster. What it will be doing is, once it sees that an upcoming bit of scheduled work or a flow run is due to be run, it will spin up an ECS task to execute that flow run. To highlight the fact that Prefect is a very polite orchestrator, with this hybrid model, again, I can't emphasize this enough, the worker is sending outbound requests only. Prefect does not have ingress access into your environment, and it doesn't need it in order to orchestrate your work. So that's the beauty of the hybrid model. To really drive the point home, the hybrid model represents separation between the orchestration environment and your execution environment. Your flow code runs on your own infrastructure. The flow code itself is stored inside of your private storage, whether that's Git-based, a Docker image, in a bucket, etc. Prefect Cloud is only responsible for storing metadata, logs, artifacts, things of that nature. Data is encrypted at rest and in transit, and Prefect is also SOC 2 Type 2 compliant, so depending on your security posture, that may be an added bonus for you. Here's another example for the hybrid work pool setup that we're going to cover, and that is the process work pool and worker. If you want to use a process worker and process work pool, you can do so using .deploy again. You'll also specify the flow code stored in your repository of choice using the from source method. You'll specify a process work pool, and then you will spin up the process worker where you would like the work to execute, and it will begin picking up those scheduled flow runs. If you go into the Prefect dashboard and navigate over to the work pools page, you will see that there is a process work pool type that you can pick. This is what it would look like and what you would select to create the work pool. Once you do that, you can go ahead and add your configuration to the work pool template. Here you can load in a bunch of stuff, environment variables, labels, things of that nature. In a similar fashion to the script that we used to deploy to our managed execution work pool, this script is designed to deploy to a process work pool. So again, we are using from source and .deploy, both of those methods. We've specified the source and entry point in our from source method and have given a name to our deployment in the .deploy method, but in this time we're specifying the process work pool in the work pool name. Once we have run the script in the previous slide and have created our deployment, we will be able to start a worker. So what we would do to create a process worker is open up a new terminal window and run prefect worker start, and then pass in the name of the work pool using the -- pool flag there. Once the worker is up and running, it will then watch the work pool for scheduled runs. Similarly to how we were running a deployment with .serve, we can run a CLI command to kick off our new deployment. In this case, it would be prefect deployment run, and then we are passing in the name of the deployment, so myflow, and then the local process deployment name. And once we have kicked off a new run, we will be able to see the flow run logs in the worker's terminal window. Since it is a process worker, the flow run will be running in the same process as the worker itself. So what's happening at runtime? First things first, the worker kicks off the scheduled flow run. The code is then pulled from your GitHub repository or the location that you specified in the from source method. The code is run in a local subprocess. Prefect will monitor the state from there on out, and then to clean everything up, the subprocess exits. Let's dive into the workers concept a little bit more. To recap the description that I gave previously, workers are long-running processes that live in the client side of the house. They pull for scheduled flow runs from work pools, and they must match a work pool in regards to their type to pick up work. So you would pair a process worker with a process work pool, an ECS worker with an ECS work pool, and so on and so forth. If you're familiar with the concept of agents, which is an outdated concept at this point, workers are a smarter version of agents. So here is an example of the flow of information in this hybrid structure. So you can see here the separation of your environment from Prefect Cloud. The worker is polling for work from work pool A. So worker A is paired with work pool A. Work pool A is kind of acting as the secretary for the worker and organizing all of the upcoming work that the worker is responsible for spinning up infrastructure for. You can actually have multiple workers polling the same work pool as well. So that is something that you can certainly do if you want to distribute work that way. Here is another representation of the hybrid setup, specifically using Kubernetes and ECS. As you can see here, the workers are hosted in separate environments, so one in Kubernetes and one for the ECS environment. And we have two different work pool types, each paired up with their corresponding worker of a similar type. And you can check out the flow of information between these two environments. Another example of the hybrid work pool and worker setup is to use Docker. Why exactly would you want to use Docker to deploy your workflows? Well, here are a few of the reasons why. You get the same operating environment everywhere. It's lighter weight than a virtual machine. Generally, it uses Linux, it's portable, it's popular, and a lot of Prefect work pools, other than the process work pool, are actually leveraging Docker in some way, shape, or form. So for example, the Kubernetes work pool leverages Docker containers and images. So does the ECS work pool, the Azure Container Instances work pool. There's just a bunch that make use of Docker. So if you want to use a Docker work pool to run your flows in Docker containers, first you're going to want to make sure that you have Docker installed on your machine. So we're just going to be testing things out locally, or if you want to give this a spin, I'd recommend getting started locally if you can. So make sure you have Docker started on your machine. Create a Docker type work pool in Prefect Cloud, similarly to how we've been walking through the creation of managed execution work pools, process work pools. You'll go ahead and create a work pool of type Docker through the Prefect Cloud dashboard. Then you will start a Docker worker that polls the corresponding work pool that you've created. And then you will go about creating a deployment that specifies the new Docker work pool. If you end up kicking off that deployment, whether it's from the CLI or the UI or the Python SDK, what that will do is it will spin up a Docker container, or rather the Docker worker will spin up a new Docker container to run your flow. Here is an example of what that option is going to look like in the work pools page when you go to create the Docker container. So you will select that option. And once you have the Docker work pool form up, you'll have the option to edit the base job template. This is where you can add those nice little environment variables that will get applied to the execution environment. You can also specify a default image that gets used for your flow runs. So if you want to do that there, you absolutely can. There are a bunch of other options for the base job template that you can configure as well, such as volumes, network mode. And the world is your oyster when it comes to setting up the infrastructure configuration. And once this gets saved for the work pool template, it'll just continue to apply to the new flow runs that are submitted to this particular work pool. And it'll be applied to the environment that gets spun up when they are executed. Okay, so to run flows in Docker containers, you may actually consider packaging the code into the Docker image along with your dependencies. And you have the option of doing that with the .deploy method. So you can see the example here. We're creating a deployment for this flow. We've got the Docker work pool passed in, and we are also specifying an image that we want to use for this particular deployment. And we also specified that we don't want to push this image anywhere else. You do not need to use the from source method in this scenario if you are baking the flow code directly into the image. All right, continuing on this topic, the .deploy method, once you run that, it will create a Docker image with your flow code baked into it by default. So you'll specify a name for the new image that you're creating. You'll specify push equals false to not push the image to a registry. And as far as best practices go, it's recommended to create a requirements.txt file with pinned package versions to install into your image. Here's a bit more information concerning the Docker worker. So to start a Docker type worker to connect to a work pool, you'll need to run the command that you'll see here. So prefect worker start -p is just an abbreviation for -pool, and then you're going to pass in the name of your Docker pool. If you want to make sure that you have the packages that are necessary, make sure you run prefect worker start -p, insert work pool name here, and then install policy. For your convenience, Prefect provides base Docker images for you to use, and you can customize the base image. Once you have your new Docker deployment available, you can go ahead and run it. And what will happen next is the Docker worker will pull the Docker image that's listed out in the deployment, and it will spin up a Docker container using that image. Then the flow code will run in the Docker container, and once everything is done, the container will exit. If you're running Docker locally using Docker Desktop, you can actually see these new containers spinning up when you execute your flow runs. So I would encourage you to check that out and watch everything happen in real time. Here are a few reminders before attempting to do this yourself. You'll need to have Docker installed on your machine and running. You'll want to have the Prefect Docker library installed as well. That's part of the Prefect integration library suite. And you'll want to ensure that you have that Docker worker started in your environment and polling for scheduled runs. In summation, we've covered a few different hybrid work pool types in the previous slide. We started with running flows using the process work pool, so running flows as local subprocesses. We've talked a little bit about using Docker, using serverless options such as ECS, ACI, GCR, and Vertex AI, and Kubernetes as well. For all of these hybrid work pool types, you will require a worker in your infrastructure polling the work pool for upcoming scheduled work. Now, moving away from the worker work pool hybrid model, let's talk about push work pools. What are push work pools? They're another way to run flows on serverless infrastructure. However, you do not need a worker in your environment to use them. There are a variety of different work pool types for you to pick and choose from that are specifically push work pools. There's one for ECS, Cloud Run, Azure Container Instances, Modal, Coiled. There's quite a few to choose from. When using push work pools, Prefect will create everything for you with the -- provision infra flag. So there are a few prereqs that you'll need to have before running this command. You'll need to ensure that you have an account with your cloud provider with the correct permissions. You'll want to make sure that the CLI tool for that cloud provider is installed in your environment where you're running this command. And you want to make sure that you're authenticated locally to your cloud provider account as well. If you check off all those boxes, then you'll be able to run a command that's similar to the one down below that uses the provision infra flag. So here you can see we are creating a work pool and we're specifying a type. In this case, it is a modal push work pool, and Prefect will provision the infrastructure on your behalf if you incorporate that flag. Here's a nice little tip for you as you're getting set up with work pools. If you want to pause work to a particular work pool, you can actually just toggle it off from the Prefect Cloud UI. All right, we have come to the end of the 104 module. You've seen how to create work pool-based deployments using the .deploy method. You learned a little bit more about the hybrid model and how you can use workers and work pools to run your workflows in different environments. You learned how to bake flow code into Docker images using the Python SDK. We covered how to run flows in a variety of infrastructure types. In the last little bit, we covered how to pause and resume work that is being sent to work pools. You are now ready to give the lab a try. So here are the instructions for the lab. Let's go ahead and make one of our weather forecast workflows more powerful. We'll create a deployment with the .deploy method that uses a prefect-managed or processed work pool. Just a quick reminder, the managed work pool type is specific to Prefect Cloud only, so that is not available in OSS. And depending on your tier of Prefect Cloud, it may be the case that Prefect-managed is the only work pool type that you are eligible to use, because I believe the process work pool and other work pools that allow you to bring your own compute are exclusive to the paid tiers. So just something to keep in mind. You still can spin up your own local server if you would like to try out the process work pool. In fact, I'd encourage you to do so, along with the Docker work pool, Kubernetes work pool. You're more than welcome to give it a try there. Next, you're going to create a work pool from the UI. And in doing so, you'll create a deployment that references flow code stored in your own GitHub repository. You can use the fetch weather flow if you like, just to keep things simple. Don't forget to push your code to your GitHub repo manually. So Prefect will not push code to GitHub. You will need to ensure that the code that you want to run is available in the repository when you are passing in the flow code storage location to your .deploy method. If you're using a process work pool, go ahead and start a worker locally to pick it up. You can just run that prefect worker start command inside of a terminal on your machine if you would like. Once you have that available, it'll pick up these scheduled flow runs. And last but not least, once you have a work pool set up in your environment and you're either using the managed execution work pool or you're using a process work pool, go ahead and try to run some flows using that work pool. If you breeze through all of those previous steps, then what you can try and do is knock out some of these stretch goals. So try pausing and resuming a work pool from the UI, experiment with adjusting fields in a work pool based job template to see what happens. And if you have Docker installed on your machine, go ahead and create a deployment where you bake your flow code into a Docker image using .deploy. And don't forget to start a Docker worker on your machine and create a Docker work pool if you're going to give the Docker hybrid model setup a try. I hope you are all excited for the 104 lab. I have an example pulled up here that is going to allow us to deploy using Prefect-managed execution work pool. The first couple things I need to do, though, are exclusively in the Prefect Cloud UI, so I'm going to make this screen just a little bit bigger. And to clarify, you will not be able to use Prefect-managed execution in the Prefect open source server. So if you're self-hosting, managed execution won't be available to you. It's only available to Prefect Cloud. All right, with that being said, let's go to our work pools page and create a new managed execution work pool. Since this is a free tier account, I only have the option of selecting Prefect-managed, so I'll move forward with that. And I'm going to name this my managed work pool. I can give it a nice description if I want to be more detailed about what kind of work this flow or this work pool is supposed to run, whether it's work that's just for production or work that's just for development. I can specify that here. And I can also set the flow run concurrency to a specific number. This will influence the number of flow runs that are allowed to run at a given time for this work pool. I'm just going to go ahead and leave it as unlimited for the time being. If I hit next, it'll take me to the work pool base template. So this is where we can save a lot of fun infrastructure configurations that will be applied to future deployments that are sent to this work pool or future deployed flow runs that are run using this work pool. You can see that there is a pip packages field where if you wanted to add extra libraries, you could do that. The managed execution work pool uses the Prefect 3 base image to execute flow runs in Prefect's cloud infrastructure. So if you are using extra libraries or dependencies, those will not be available if you just use the base image. You'll need to load in those packages and specify either them here in the base job template, or you'll need to pass them in to the deployment if you're creating it through the Python SDK. I'm going to leave everything as is for simplicity's sake and create the work pool. Now that I have my work pool available, I'm going to go and make this screen a little bit smaller so we can take a look at the script that I'm going to use to create my deployment for this managed work pool. I already have my Prefect environment set up, so I have UV set up here with my Prefect installation ready to go. So if you haven't done that yet, I would say follow along with the 101 lab. That's just at the end of the 101 video, and finish that first before proceeding to the next step. If you've already done that though, let's go ahead and walk through what the script is actually doing. So we have an if name equals main block here, and we are deploying a flow from this source location. So the source is the GitHub repository that I've been using for our program so far. So this is a link to that. And then I have the entry point specified here. So this is indicating where in this repository, in the source, does this flow live that I want to deploy. So it's in the 102 folder, it's in the weather2tasks.py file, and the name of the function or the flow function that I want to deploy is called pipeline. Then once I've specified my from source or my source, I am using the .deploy method to create my deployment. In this case, I am passing in a name for the deployment and my work pool name. As you can see, this my managed work pool name matches the work pool that I created in my Prefect Cloud dashboard. Now, if I were to go ahead and run this script, we will see that a new deployment is created. I would be able to just run this deployment using the CLI by copying this command here, but just to show you beforehand, you can see now that there is a new deployment associated with this work pool, and it is the one that we just created. And if I were to do a quick run of this flow, we'll see that it kicks off a new run that is being sent to the managed execution environment. And without having to set up any cloud infrastructure, this run is going to run using Cloud Infra. And just like that, now it is a completed flow run. So we have successfully run a flow using Prefect-managed execution environment. Now, if you want to take a look at the other examples that are available to you, I would recommend checking out the 104 folder, or the folder that is associated to this module in the GitHub repo. There's a few different examples that you can pick and choose from. Congratulations on making it to the end of module 104. I will see you for the next one.